for more insight into its latest World Economic Outlook. Let's bring in William Lee, Chief Economist at the Milken Institute. William, always good to see you on our show. Thank you. First, let's break down the IMF report. Where do the world's biggest economies stand right now?
It all depends on the vaccine situation. As Gita said, the divide is really where the vaccine divide is. Those who have the vaccine and have successfully administered them are doing quite well and resuming normality at a fairly rapid pace, like here in the United States. But the countries that don't have it, especially in the emerging markets, we see that there's a lot of still suffering, a lot of shutdowns, and a lot of cutbacks in terms of employment and output.
Is that the only contribution to the difference in growth, or are we seeing sub-factors also at play here?
That's a great question, because it's never just one thing. And vaccines are the main cause that the IMF points out, but supporting underlying policies of fiscal stimulus, providing underlying infrastructure support for maintaining an active and efficient economy is absolutely vital. Here in the United States, we have a big debate as to what's really needed in that infrastructure bill. In Europe, you have discussions about what is needed to maintain the health of the economy in terms of distributing vaccines. And in China, you see a big debate between domestic consumption, the dual strategy that Xi Jinping has outlined, and also the need to remain active in the rest of the world. So the tensions around the world are really varying and quite different, but all of them put at risk the speed of the recovery and the pace at which we can return to normality.
One of the things we said very early on in this pandemic is that coronavirus revealed underlying ails wherever it went. So in the U.S., it was the issues of healthcare access. It seems on a global scale, it's really highlighting the gap between poor and developing countries, and that's a gap that has been widening long before any of this happened.
And much of the gap is actually not just an institutional gap. That is always the case that when there are huge disparities in wealth and income, the rich manage to get the resources fairly quickly and the poor are always lagging behind. But here in the United States, a lot of the disparity in health access and vaccine access has to do with mindset. There's a mindset out there that we don't need the vaccine because we're protected, because we're young, because we're so-and-so, because we're so-and-so. There are all sorts of excuses why they don't want to be vaccinated. The anti-vaxxers, I think, is really the attitudinal problem that we need to address. And around the world, in India, there's a similar problem that we don't trust our domestically made vaccines. We want to have Western vaccines. So there are, as I said, different causes around the world for why it is that there's not only economic disparity, but also health access disparity and intellectual mindsets that allow that gap to be closed.
The Trump administration had sort of pushed off COVAX, the World Health Organization, and really global efforts to fight this thing. And Joe Biden, now as president, has tried to change that, in the U.S. stepping up to contribute to COVAX and the move to vaccinate the rest of the world. Is it working? I mean, you obviously can't vaccinate half a room. So are we seeing a change?
We're seeing more access to vaccines, but as I said, there's an attitudinal problem of accepting the vaccines. For example, there's a situation in Taiwan where they don't want to accept Chinese vaccines. They'd rather have access to Pfizer, and not just Pfizer through the Chinese distributor, but Pfizer directly. So I think the distributional issues involve a lot of the political conflicts that were already pre-existing that kind of change people's mindset about what's considered an acceptable solution and what's not an acceptable solution. And often politics is involved there.
Now, we've been discussing the macro. There is obviously here the micro. I spoke to a day laborer here in Washington who told me he wasn't vaccinated and wasn't going to get vaccinated because he couldn't afford this to take off time for the side effects. How are we seeing Delta variant affecting key economic factors like jobs and other things?
Well, I think that little explanation you just gave is a total non sequitur. A lot of employers are subsidizing people with extra time off to get vaccinated. So those who are not getting vaccinated are just cooking up excuses. But there is a problem in terms of the labor market itself coming back online again. And here in the United States, it's absolutely vital the service sector comes back online because that's the largest part of consumption. Now, service sector employees are also the lowest paid employees. So you find a lot of service sector employers are having to raise wages in order to attract workers back into these jobs, because a lot of workers during the shutdown have moved on, improved their skills, and are moving into higher paying jobs, leaving these low paid service jobs empty and having employers finding a hard time filling them.
How effective have central banks been in helping economies bounce back?
Oh, the central banks are playing an absolutely vital role because they are providing the liquidity in the financial markets to be able to finance the shutdowns in terms of allowing employers to borrow money when they need to stay alive, but also be able to finance new investments, because what's absolutely vital going forward is to move into highly productive activities and make investments that improve people's productivity and raise people's wages. And investment is absolutely key to that, and key to investment is having the financing available. The Fed, ECB, BOJ, all the central banks around the world have gone out of their way to ensure adequate liquidity. In fact, some people might say they've ensured too much liquidity, and we see these huge asset price bubbles that might be a danger of financial stability going forward.
William Lee from Milken Institute, thank you for your insight.
Thanks for having me.